So your heading for this lesson here is vaccination. And the learning intention is to explain how vaccination protects you against disease. So a vaccine is given if a disease is particularly harmful or easily spread among the population. The vaccine is a weakened or dead form of the pathogen. You might hear it referred to as attenuated, which means weakened version of the pathogen. So ideally, if you get injected with this, you're not going to get sick. The weakened pathogen is harmless, but your immune system responds to the vaccine by producing antibodies. Remember, your antibodies are those Y-shaped proteins that are produced by lymphocytes. So antibody here, and this is just going over what we did last week, produced by lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. The other type of white blood cell being your phagocytes. So a Y-shaped protein produced by lymphocytes, that's what an antibody is. So you'll be injected with a weakened or attenuated version of the pathogen, and your immune system responds to the vaccine by producing antibodies, which are the Y-shaped proteins produced by lymphocytes. Remember, these Y-shaped proteins can do a couple of different jobs. They can make phagocytosis easily by clumping together the pathogen, so your macrophages can eat them easier. And they could also actually block some bacteria, for instance, releasing toxins, among other things. Also, as you guys already know, that your third line of defense, once it's initiated by this weakened pathogen, it's going to make billions of memory lymphocytes against the pathogen. The idea there is they will remain stored in your body, in your lymph nodes, waiting for that pathogen to return. If you happen to become infected by the pathogen in the future, so this is what we would call second exposure. The memory lymphocytes are activated more rapidly and produce trillions and trillions of antibodies. So those individual lymphocytes, an individual cell is producing 4,000 to 5,000 antibodies per second. So your bloodstream and your lymph system is getting flooded with antibodies. The idea there is you don't end up getting sick because your antibodies kill the pathogen before it can take hold and make you sick. And actually before you can transmit it onto other people as well. Vaccines provide long-term immunity, but those memory cells, they may not last forever. Therefore, you're going to need booster shots. And you've probably all had booster shots before. You get your first inoculation, you get your first vaccination. Years, months, weeks, possibly later, you'll have to get a booster shot just to improve the number of those memory cells and antibodies being produced by those memory cells. Just very quickly going back over this slide here. A vaccine is a weakened or sometimes dead form of the pathogen. It's not going to make you sick. The weakened pathogen is harmless. Your immune system responds to the vaccine by producing antibodies. You make antibodies, you also make billions of memory lymphocytes. If you become infected again, those millions of memory lymphocytes are ready to produce trillions of antibodies to fight the pathogen so you don't end up getting sick. They provide long-term immunity, but they may not last forever, and you require booster shots to make sure that you're fully vaccinated. Okay, let's have a quick look here at how vaccines work. We know that a vaccine causes the body to produce antibodies, but also the vaccine causes the body to produce memory lymphocytes. If you become infected with that specific pathogen in the future, and we call that the second exposure, those memory lymphocytes are going to make lots of antibodies and they're going to do it very quickly. So the second time you get infected, as I've already mentioned, your body fights it very rapidly. You don't get sick, and even better, you shouldn't be able to pass it on to other people because your body destroys the pathogen before it can reproduce in any numbers that would allow it to actually be transmitted from person to person. So have a look at this chart on the left here and have a look at what's actually happening. We've got time on the x-axis and we've got concentration of antibodies in the blood on the y-axis. So you might have a first exposure to a microorganism or a virus down here at time 0. This could be artificially induced via a vaccination, or you might have just been exposed to this pathogen in nature. It might have just happened naturally. You can see here that the number of antibodies, the peak number of antibodies here, actually takes quite a while, like over 20 days. And that whole time, while your body's fighting this particular pathogen, over those 22 days or so, you're getting very sick. Your body's trying to fight it. You're producing antibodies. Memory cells are being produced in these first 20 days to fight this particular pathogen. And then you'll get to a peak number of antibodies. The pathogen will be destroyed and the number of antibodies in your blood will start to decrease. That would all take, well, it varies, but on this graph here, roughly over a month there for that whole episode to be complete from first exposure, peak number of antibodies. And remember, at this point in this chart here, the first 20-something days, you're probably very sick while your body's trying to fight this particular pathogen. You'd have a fever. You'd be feeling pretty miserable. Now, if you have a look, the number of antibodies in the blood is actually plateaued here. And it's actually higher than when we started back at time 0. So you've actually produced some antibodies in your blood. You've also produced those memory lymphocytes as well. Let's just say you get exposed a second time, so about 64 days here to that particular pathogen. The second exposure causes a rapid increase here in the number of antibodies produced. Your body will fight this pathogen much faster because of those memory lymphocytes producing antibodies. The second time that pathogen comes back, we call that the second exposure. And when you compare it to the first exposure, far more antibodies are produced the second time around because of the memory lymphocytes. You won't get as sick, and this will fight the infection much faster than that first exposure. So COVID that we're all dealing with at the moment, it's a severe acute respiratory syndrome. It causes COVID-19, which is the disease, and I think you guys already know that COVID actually stands for coronavirus disease, and 2019 is when it appeared. It infects epithelial cells in the nose, throat, and lungs, which is why it's a respiratory syndrome. Epithelial just means any cell that's a barrier to the external environment and the inside of your body. So the lining of your throat, nose, your skin even, we can classify those as epithelial cells. And that's what this virus here is very good at infecting, the epithelial cells in the nose, throat, and lungs. Very quickly going to talk about herd immunity, and then we're done for this little lesson here. So if you have a look on the left, we're looking at whooping cough. Now, you've got a research task coming up where you'll actually have to look at data similar to this and analyze it. So let's just have a quick look at what this graph is showing us, and then we'll have a look at this idea of herd immunity on the right. So we have vaccination for whooping cough appearing around about, what are we looking at there, 1956. And you can see the number of cases starts to drop off immediately once vaccination begins. I mean, it takes a couple of years to take effect, but the overall trend from when vaccination began is a downward trend in towards the mid-1970s. Before that vaccination began, you had some peaks, you had some troughs as well, but overall, it's a fairly steady trend in the number of cases. Then you can see an overall decrease once vaccination was actually introduced. Interestingly, having a look at this green line, this is vaccine uptake. So this is the percent of people who are actually getting the vaccination. Fairly steady, about 80% of the population being vaccinated. Then there was, for whatever reason, a drop-off in the uptake in these vaccines, and less people were getting vaccinated. So you can see here as the number of people getting vaccinated dropped, the cases of whooping cough started to increase again. And those peaks almost match up there. So the 30% here, so a low percent of the population being vaccinated, corresponded roughly here with a peak in the number of cases. And you can see here it says the effect of the whooping cough scare on uptake of the vaccine and number of cases of the disease. So this obviously frightened people here. All of a sudden, after this decrease in the number of cases of whooping cough, you have a peak here, and people started getting worried about that, obviously. What you can see then happening is the number of vaccinations starts to take off, and we get up to almost 94% of the population vaccinated for whooping cough. And lo and behold, as that vaccination uptake increases, there is a little peak here and there's another little peak here, but you can see the overall trend is a decrease in the number of whooping cough cases. So looking at these two pictures on the right here, we've got two situations, two scenarios. Scenario number one, scenario number two. Now, if you have a look at number one here, lots of blue people in this first community. Those blue people, they're not immunized, they haven't been vaccinated, and they are healthy, so they don't have the disease. So we have a population with a very low vaccination rate. There's not many people here who have been immunized against that pathogen. Now, our red people in these two scenarios, our red people are infectious. They're going to pass that disease on, and you can see what happens if no one is immunized in the population, then you will end up with more people catching the disease, obviously. Now, herd immunity, the idea is it's not that everybody, 100% of the population needs to be vaccinated. Herd immunity basically means that if enough people are vaccinated, that's good enough. We can control the disease if we have a certain percentage of the population that's been vaccinated. So scenario number two down here, we have all of these yellow people in the population now. Yellow people, they're vaccinated and they're healthy. And you've still got a couple of blue people in here, so they're healthy. They haven't been vaccinated. But remember, that's okay. Herd immunity, you don't have to have 100% of the population vaccinated. You have two people come along in this scenario and they are infectious and they're going to pass on that disease. Well, there's less people for them to pass it along to, number one, because all of the people have been immunized. Those blue people, yes, they still will become infected, these guys in here, but far less people, far fewer people are actually going to contract the disease. So it's manageable. The disease in scenario number two is manageable if the majority of the population is vaccinated. Less people to pass it on and less people to actually catch the disease. So herd immunity, what we're looking at here is one, not all of the population needs to be vaccinated. If the majority of the population is vaccinated, I'm about to run out of room here, the disease is manageable. And why is it manageable? Well, again, have a look at situation number one and compare it to number two. This is the situation here, number one, that we're seeing in Australia at the moment. In Sydney in particular, no one's vaccinated, or a very low percent of the population is vaccinated, and it doesn't take long for something as infectious and contagious as the Delta strain to sweep through the population and infect more people. Herd immunity, scenario number two, remember, not 100% of the population is vaccinated, but you get to a certain percent of the population being vaccinated, and a couple of things happen. Even if someone is infectious, there's less people they can spread that to, number one. And you're still going to have people that will become infected. Not 100% of the population is vaccinated, but it's manageable. You're not getting whole scale infections like you see in the top scenario here. So that's herd immunity.